an armoured formation capable of offensive operations deep behind enemy lines, hundreds of kilometres from the nearest friendly tank. This thinking began in the 1930s under Marshal Tukhachevsky and his theory of deep operations. By the 1960s, it had produced the BMD family, a series of air-droppable infantry fighting vehicles that gave Soviet airborne divisions something no Western equivalent possessed. Roughly 500 armoured vehicles per division, all of them light enough to parachute from an IL-76 transport aircraft. But every one of those vehicles had the same critical weakness. Its 57mm gun was adequate against light armour in the 1950s, but meaningless against anything built after 1960. The BMD-1, which replaced it, carried a 73mm low-pressure gun that was obsolete against modern armour by the time it entered service. The BMD-2 replaced it with a 30mm autocannon, effective against light vehicles but useless against anything with real protection. The older ASU-85, a dedicated airborne assault gun, mounted an 85mm rifled cannon that could not penetrate the frontal armour of any NATO main battle tank built after 1970. Soviet paratroopers could deploy in strength, they could fight infantry, they could suppress soft targets. But the moment enemy armour appeared on the battlefield, they had nothing capable of stopping it. The requirement was issued in 1982. Build a vehicle light enough to parachute from an IL-76, amphibious enough to swim across rivers without bridging equipment, and armed with the same 125mm smoothbore cannon carried by frontline Soviet main battle tanks. A gun capable of destroying any armoured vehicle on the planet, mounted on a chassis that weighed less than a third of the tanks it was designed to kill. The Volgograd tractor plant, the same facility that had designed every BMD variant since the 1960s, took the contract. The turret and gun system were developed separately at Artillery Plant No. 9 in Yekaterinburg, the facility responsible for producing Soviet tank guns. The chassis drew heavily from the Object 934 prototype, itself a close relative of the BMD-3. The gun, designated 2A-75, was a low-recoil derivative of the 2A-46 fitted to the T-72 and T-80. It had no muzzle brake, it used a fume extractor and thermal sleeve, and it fired every type of 125mm ammunition in the Soviet inventory, including armour-piercing fins, stabilised discarding sabot rounds, high-explosive anti-tank rounds, fragmentation rounds, and laser-guided anti-tank missiles with an effective range beyond 4,000 metres. The autoloader held 22 ready rounds from a total of 40 carried on board. Rate of fire reached 6 to 8 rounds per minute. The vehicle carried a crew of 3, a driver seated centrally in the hull, a commander and a gunner in the two-man turret. The engine was a 2V062S multi-fuel diesel producing 510 horsepower, giving the 18-ton vehicle a power-to-weight ratio of roughly 28 horsepower per ton, faster across open ground than most infantry fighting vehicles and competitive with some light tanks. Top speed on roads reached 71 km per hour. Off-road it managed 45 to 50. Range on internal fuel was 500 km, and the vehicle was fully amphibious, driven through water by twin water jets at 8 to 10 km per hour. Capable of firing its main gun while afloat within a limited frontal arc. But the most extraordinary engineering achievement was not the gun, the engine, or the amphibious capability, it was the parachute system. The Sprut was designed to be loaded into the cargo hold of an IL-76 military transport aircraft and extracted in flight using the PBS 950 family of multi-canopy parachute platforms. The specific system developed for the Sprut, designated PBS 952, was rated to support loads up to 18,000 kilograms. The vehicle would slide from the aircraft's rear ramp, the parachutes would deploy, retro rockets would fire in the final seconds before impact to cushion the landing, and the vehicle would touch down intact and operational. The crew rode inside during the drop. They did not jump separately. They did not need to locate the vehicle on the ground. They landed with their hands on the controls, ready to start the engine, drive off the platform and engage targets within minutes. No Western military had ever attempted to airdrop a vehicle this heavily armed with a crew inside. The concept had been pioneered decades earlier by VDV Commander General Vasily Margolov, whose insistence on crew inside delivery for the BMD series had been considered reckless by many Soviet officers. Extending that philosophy to a vehicle carrying a full-size tank gun was something else entirely. Now, before we get into where this vehicle was meant to fight, and what actually happened when Russia went to war, if you are enjoying this deep dive into Cold War armoured engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps this channel keep producing content like this. Development of the Sprut began in earnest in 1984. By 1991, prototypes had completed state trials with broadly positive results, but the parachute delivery system remained problematic, and the collapse of the Soviet Union froze the program entirely. Funding vanished. The Volgograd tractor plant struggled to stay operational. The Sprut sat in limbo for nearly a decade. It re-emerged around 2001. A second round of state trials followed. And on the 9th of January 2006, the Russian Ministry of Defense formally accepted the Tu-S-25 Sprut-ST into service with the VDV, Russia's airborne forces. Production ran from 2005 to 2010, and then it stopped. The total number built remains disputed across sources, but the most consistent figure places the fleet at approximately 24 vehicles, with some estimates reaching as high as 36. The original requirement had called for 85 to 110. Russia built fewer than a third of the minimum order, and then cancelled further procurement. Reports indicate the cancellation followed a fuel leak fire on a vehicle after a Red Square parade, though VDV commander General Vladimir Shamanov later disputed the circumstances. 24 vehicles for the entire Russian airborne force. A vehicle designed to be the decisive anti-armor weapon for paratroopers landing behind enemy lines, and fewer were built than a single tank company typically operates. And then came the wars. In 2008, Russia went to war with Georgia. The VDV deployed in force, conducting air assault operations into South Ossetia. They fought without the Sprut. In Syria, beginning in 2015, Russian forces, including elements associated with the VDV, conducted operations across multiple provinces. The Sprut did not deploy, and in February 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the VDV was at the center of the operation. Airborne units attempted helicopter assaults on Hostomel Airport outside Kiev. They fought in Kherson. They were committed to some of the most intense ground combat of the entire war. The Sprut was nowhere. VDV units took devastating casualties in conventional ground fighting across eastern and southern Ukraine. They fought in trenches, in tree lines, in shattered urban blocks. They fought the kind of war where a 125mm gun on a light chassis could, in theory, have provided exactly the direct fire support paratroopers desperately needed. It did not appear. As of mid-2026, there is no verified photographic or video evidence that the Tu-S-25 Sprut-ST has ever been deployed in combat. It does not appear in open-source intelligence loss databases. It has not been photographed destroyed, captured, or abandoned on any battlefield. The vehicle built specifically to give Russian paratroopers the firepower to fight enemy armor has sat in garrison through every conflict where that firepower was needed most. The reasons are practical. With only 24 vehicles in existence, the fleet is too small to risk in a war of attrition. The vehicle's aluminum armor, designed to save weight for air delivery, offers frontal protection against 23mm autocannon fire at 500 meters. Everywhere else, it stops only small arms and shell splinters. On a battlefield saturated with anti-tank guided missiles, first-person view drones, and loitering munitions, a vehicle with the armor of an infantry fighting vehicle and the silhouette of a light tank becomes a priority target with almost no survivability margin. And the mission the Sprut was designed for, a mass parachute assault of mechanized forces deep behind enemy lines, has never been attempted by Russia in any of its post-Soviet conflicts. The VDV has fought in every Russian war since the fall of the Soviet Union. It has fought as motorized infantry, as air assault troops delivered by helicopter, as conventional ground forces plugging gaps in the front line. It has never fought the way the Sprut was designed to support it. The vehicle was engineered to solve a very specific problem. What happens when that problem never materializes is a question no specification sheet can answer. Compared to its nearest equivalents, the Sprut occupies a position that is genuinely unique and genuinely lonely. The American M8 armored gun system, a 1990s attempt to build a light air deployable tank with a 105mm gun, was cancelled before production. The Stryker M1128 mobile gun system, a wheeled vehicle mounting the same 105mm cannon, was retired by late 2022 after persistent reliability failures with its autoloader. The Italian Centauro, an 8x8 wheeled tank destroyer available in both 105 and 120mm variants, weighs nearly 30 tons and was never designed for parachute delivery. The Swedish CV9120, a tracked chassis mounting a 120mm smoothbore, remains a demonstrator that has never secured a production contract, and China's ZTQ-15, a 33 to 36 ton light tank with a 105mm gun, is designed for high-altitude plateau operations, not airborne delivery. The closest historical parallel is the American M551 Sheridan, an airdroppable light tank with a 152mm gun launcher that served from the 1960s through the Gulf War. The Sheridan proved the concept was viable, but also demonstrated every limitation: thin armor, volatile ammunition, a gun system so unreliable that crews often refused to fire the missile variant. The Sprut was, in many ways, Russia's answer to the Sheridan, built a generation later with better technology, but carrying the same fundamental trade-off: firepower at the cost of survival. None of the Sprut's modern competitors combine its specific characteristics. None of them mount a 125mm gun on a chassis light enough to parachute from a transport aircraft. None of them are amphibious. None of them allow the crew to ride inside during air delivery. The Sprut does all of these things. Whether any of these things matter on a modern battlefield is the question that remains unanswered. Russia has not abandoned the concept. An upgraded variant, the Sprut SDM-1, entered state trials in 2020 and completed them in early 2022. The modernized version uses a unified chassis shared with the BMD-4M, a more powerful engine, and a substantially improved fire control system with thermal imaging sights comparable to those fitted to the T-90M. In March 2023, the manufacturer announced that the Sprut SDM-1 had been recommended for adoption by the Russian army, and that serial production preparations were underway. Whether those thermal sights can be produced in sufficient quantity, while Russia simultaneously struggles to equip its frontline main battle tanks with the same components, remains an open question. Western analysts have noted that the factories producing modern optics for Russian armour are already operating under extreme strain and diverting components to a niche airborne platform, while T-72 and T-90 production lines demand the same parts would represent a significant industrial choice. India evaluated the Sprut SDM-1 for its own light tank requirement, known as Project Zorawar, triggered by the 2020 border standoff with China in Ladakh. Rosoboronexport offered the vehicle in 2021. India ultimately chose to develop an indigenous design, the Zorawar light tank, built by DRDO and L&T, mounting a 105mm Cockerel gun on a 25-ton chassis with substantially better armour protection. The Indian decision reflected a broader judgment. In an era of precision-guided munitions and drone warfare, protection matters more than it did when the Sprut was conceived. 1985, the Volgograd tractor plant, engineers drawing a vehicle that defied every conventional rule of armoured warfare. Too light to survive, too heavily armed for its weight class, designed for a mission, mass airborne mechanised assault that the Soviet Union believed would define the next Great War. That war never came. The Soviet Union collapsed. The vehicle sat unfinished for a decade. When it finally entered service, fewer than 24 were built. When Russia went to war, it stayed in garrison. The battlefield it was designed for, a Cold War nightmare of paratroopers landing behind NATO lines and fighting enemy armour with their own tank guns, dissolved into history before the vehicle could prove whether the concept worked. The Sprut carried no inadequate armament. Its gun could kill any tank on the planet. Its mobility was extraordinary. Its amphibious capability was genuine. Its air delivery system was, by any engineering standard, remarkable. It did everything its designers promised. It could swim rivers. It could drop from the sky. It could fire a main battle tank round while floating. It could land with its crew inside, engine running, gun loaded. It was too fragile for the wars Russia actually fought, too few in number to risk, too specialized for a doctrine that never survived contact with reality. The Sprut was not a failure of engineering. It was a masterpiece built for a war that existed only in planning documents and general staff exercises. 24 vehicles, 125mm gun, 18 tons, 3 crew members sealed inside an aluminum hull, falling through the sky under parachute canopies, carrying more firepower than most armoured vehicles twice their weight. That is not engineering. That is a bet. And the battlefield has not yet decided whether Russia was right to make it. Too heavily armed to be taken seriously at its weight, too fragile to justify the engineering required to mount a weapon this powerful on a hull this thin. To understand why the Sprut existed, you need to understand the obsession that drove Soviet airborne doctrine for more than 40 years. No military in the 20th century invested more in its airborne forces than the Soviet Union.